Beast. A story by user Jake the Snake Bake Cake. Chapter 5. When they first saw the creature in the left fork of the hall, they had openly laughed at it. The squad's leader had gone as far as to imitate it, dancing back and forth in a mock replication of the thing's strange behavior. By the time the raiders had finished their meal, they were ready for some more entertainment, and it was obvious this would be suitable for a few minutes of their attention, before they could regroup with the other squads heading for the engine and the bridge. Their pack generally liked to go find those few that were on their own, and chase them down or challenge them. Generally, it was the first option. Their bloodlust usually got the better of them. But for the sport of it, they often gave their secondary victims a chance. It was usually a small one, but it always made the kill more satisfying. Many of them casually whipped out their heavy blades as they argued who could advance first. The things were designed for both one-handed and two-handed use, a weapon with a double-sided edge. As the leader swung his in a lazy arc, he stared at the strange ship beast and considered his options. The creature was unlike any he had ever seen before. No claws, no tentacles or thrashing tail, not a single primal weapon seemed to be on its lightly haired body. It was actually the most unintimidating ship beast the pirate had ever seen. To make it seem even less dangerous, it simply stood there, bobbing back and forth in some strange defensive mannerism, likely too scared to advance. Pity was not an emotion pirates felt often, but in this case it almost seemed reasonable. Damn thing obviously didn't have any rational clue what fate was waiting for it. Pity aside, behind the creature was their next meal, and it was already bleeding and terrified. Prey always tasted better when it was terrified. This was common knowledge. So there was no two ways about it. That ship beast needed to be removed. The pirate focused its many eyes upon the two white-rimmed ones on the ship beast's head, and issued a challenge to the stupid creature. It simply stared back in concentration. Not even a cry of acknowledgement announced it understood it was about to die.
"This creature must be frozen in terror,"
the raider chortled to its fellows, letting out a long gurgling laugh.
"It barely moves at all. Even its eyes won't budge."
Behind him, a chortle announced the largest of their raiding pack was stepping forward. Wiquexel, the Slayer, had come to the front. As his 3-digit feet stepped over what remained of the fallen prey, he drew a sword from his back and began to whip it through the forms. He towered above the rest of the pack, a trait seen only in the most bloodthirsty of their kind. It meant he had killed and eaten his nestmates upon hatching and grown stronger as the sole recipient of nutrients. It meant he had the most dominant of the predatory instincts. Individuals such as Wiquexel were rare among their species, as their bloodlust often led them to their own demise. Wiquexel was unlike many of those, in the simple fact that he was not dead. In fact, despite engaging in fights that seemed almost suicidal in odds, the Slayer had always emerged victorious. He had bested the strongest enemies while working for the Union, and as a pirate he had bested all of the encountered ship beasts in single combat. It was an egocentric trait of his to fight his enemies without interference. Uncharacteristic as that may be for a pirate, it wasn't without results, for Wiquexel had never even come close to losing. From tangle thrashers to draglings, he had survived to feast on their flesh. One weak and docile creature that had never seen true combat would be no match for his skill with a blade. Wiquexel threw himself forward with a perfect stroking lunge as saliva trailed behind him. He thought of nothing but sinking his jaws into that strange new flesh, and wondering what flavors it might hold. Slow and steady panting made the steam rising off of the light rifle's barrel flow in a graceful pattern as it dissipated back into the contained atmosphere of the ship. It had come close to overheating from the massive use it had just been through, and alongside the outside of the left casing, there was a dark singe from where it had been hit by returning fire. That had been extremely lucky considering what that shot would have done to the individual carrying the weapon. Had the shot been angled only slightly higher. If the odds were to balance themselves, though, luck's debt had been paid with interest this cycle, as far as the shipmaster was concerned. As she checked the monitors, she let out a hissing note of rage and frustration. The display for real-time signs of life in the other portions of the ship were not a welcome sight. Wherever crew members were displayed, the large hostile life forms also seemed to be. There was nothing to do but watch as the green dots of her crew began blinking out one by one. They had not been prepared for this type of assault, and to make things worse, they were running at half-staff. Even if they had all been armed, they were likely outnumbered anyways. A shudder ran through the ship and the monitor faded to black. If her guess was right, the boarding party had reached the engine room just then and dispatched the first FTL generator supplying a majority of the power to the bridge. A second shudder rocked through it as they killed the second one, removing any hope of breaking free. At this point, all that was left running now was the life support and the distress signal. Ytale had barely been able to shut the bridge gates before half her crew had died in a brutal and savage massacre. They had only survived because she had spent every last round of light ammo on board the bridge in under a minute. And because she had the good fortune of not having her command station 12 units to the left. If that had been the case, the boarding party would have crashed directly into the middle of them, and they would have had no means of defending themselves whatsoever. Survived was a relative term anyways, considering there was heavy plasma drilling occurring outside those doors, and they had no real weapons left among them. They were trapped, and there was no way out. Though its arm was bulging with the effort of showing its skill, he could see the blade sweeping and tracked it with ease. The creature rushed with one swing to another, but with almost no effort. The man dodged. It was as if the attacker moved in slow motion compared to his agility. Another cut whipped past, and he ducked, only to run into several punches being thrown by the creature's other limbs. Unable to do much about it, the man braced and let them hit him, keeping his focus on the blade. They bounced off of his flesh with barely a bruise, and he could swear the surprise of the creature in front of him almost threw it off balance. It landed with an angle to rotate and save the momentum of its swing for a thrust from behind its back. The clever move flew by without issue as the man ducked and sidestepped. It wasn't too slow. He was simply that much faster. As the onslaught continued, the dodging and weaving became easier as the movements of his strange foe slowly molded from something unfamiliar into a regular pattern of increasingly desperate attempts. The alien before him was beginning to strain, and the perfect form it had moments ago was no longer as precise, or even aimed at anything in particular. The foaming saliva at its mouth was gone, and a look of rising panic greeted the human. It knew, like any creature that killed another to survive, when death was staring it in the face. It flashed its sword out as quick as it could muster, but that was not enough. Unlike the creature before him, the man wore a smile. Another spinning back thrust, but this time the man had seen it coming. Landing on the balls of his feet, the man threw a quick kick as he dodged past the lunge. Though he had not put as much force into it as he thought it required, the roundhouse kick caught the creature's chest with an accurate and fluid motion, and then continued to travel for quite a ways further. The creature's body shattered as though its skeleton was made of glass. Limbs flailed in pain, torn nerves and ripped tendons, as it tried to writhe away from the human and maintain a safe distance. Astonishment was more visible than fear as reality caught up with what had just occurred. It dropped its weapon, as violent internal bleeding seeped through its torso. The once prime fighting form looked as though it was a skin filled with lumpy green meat. The infamous and legendary Waquexel the Slayer was barely minutes from death, and it was from a single blow. One single blow that had impacted with such speed and strength that it might as well have been from a vehicular impact. Disbelief still had not had enough time to come to grips and turned to terror. Slowly, it turned and tried to grasp for its companions, trying to issue commands while there was still time, but they were just as shocked as Waquexel. Their reactions were too slow to do anything but watch as the ship beast moved forward, unnaturally fast, and took up a blade from the floor where it lay. Waquexel barely had time to bellow a cry before its life ended and leaked upon the hall floor. Despite that one's apparent size, the creatures before him were lightweights in comparison to what he had expected. Though they seemed large, their density was almost a joke. and it was as if their bones were hollow. The kick that had ended the fight had been intended to simply knock it down, but instead the thing had burst like a disgusting water balloon. As the human glanced down at the green gore on the ground, he saw some blue. Its stomach contents had been emptied upon the floor with the rest of it, and there, in the middle of it, was a face. Disgust tore through him. That was the crew member's head. The fucking thing had swallowed a head. It had killed a living, breathing, thinking form of life, and eaten it. Murder was one thing, but to disrespect the dead in such a way, to kill and eat a creature capable of true thought, the rage was back in an instant. Unforgivable. He would end them. He would end them all. Zort and his personal squad had arrived just in time to see the other pack open fire on the ship beast. If his eyes weren't deceiving him, that bloody mess behind it was Waquexel. How in all the void did the thing manage that? Better not to find out, he supposed. In unison they fired upon the thing before them as the other pack expelled the last of their ammunition. To his shock and horror, the thing charged them anyways. Their light rifle rounds didn't even pierce its hide. As it tackled one of his raiders into a wall, splattering it into a liquefied mess. It quickly became clear they were facing down something not seen within the Union for hundreds of thousands of years. A beast from a high-gravity death world. One by one they were ripped apart by strength which rivaled that of a mechanical exosuit. The creature's lower limbs alone were flashing like shockwaves to break off limbs in sudden kicks of tremendous accuracy, all while an upper limb whipped a heavy class blade that tore through and ripped aside anything else. Such a weapon took years to master, and just to swing such weight with accuracy was impressive in its own right, but the beast seemed to dance with it, like it weighed nothing at all. To move such a dense and heavy weapon with no signs of balance loss was unheard of. The creature likely weighed as much as 3 of them combined, all packed into that small form. In his 15 cycles of military and raiding combat, Zort had never seen such strength. Not even from an enraged Rulla, in its death dance, would match this. It seemed as if the creature had been genetically engineered for combat. Zort watched in horror and fascination as it naturally anticipated their movements, and with disturbing ease, executed counterattacks that made the quickest of his raiders seem like spawnlings. Its arms whipped and tossed the weapon it held like a toy between them. Slowly and quietly, Zort stepped away from the melee, ducking back down the hall. He would let his crew take the glory on this one. Eventually, the beast would tire and die, just like all the rest who inhabited the ship. But he would not be the one to make it happen. That's why a captain had a crew, after all. The man stopped when the motion did, the last creature now in 2 pieces on the floor. He winced as he raised a hand and felt the burns on his skin. They covered his chest and back with thin lances of pain, and branded him with dark dashes to match. He slowed his breathing, taking heavy, deep gasps of the oxygen-rich air as he surveyed where he stood. Aside from the burns, he was covered in grime and guts among the corpses of the fallen creatures. The air smelled of death. He turned to look at the surviving crew member and expected fear. The human found none. Her song was of debt and praise, of gratitude and pride. As the crew member struggled to rise, a hand reached out, and it wasn't long before the human found himself walking through a spaceship with a singing alien on his back. At first they had moved slowly through the halls, checking every corner, but soon they were moving quickly. The enemy didn't seem interested in springing traps or setting ambushes. They were just blindly chasing and killing things when they found them. That was a good thing, because it kept them from realizing someone was returning the favor. His new companion hummed with renewed energy as her tail swept out to each intersection and provided direction to travel. A song called out to surviving crew members, but there were few, and more often than not they ran into the boarding party instead. On 3 separate occasions, the human had to retreat and set his companion down to fight, and on 3 separate occasions he lived to retrieve her again. Each time he was a little bit slower. The pain had begun to set in, and his endurance was beginning to fade. At this point he had killed around 20 of the creatures attacking the crew, and every time he thought the last of them was dead, another group was around the corner, feasting on the crew members. Sometimes they were still alive when it was happening. Of the ones that had survived, few were able to do much but lean against the wall. Their features were etched with pain and sorrow. Still, the one on his back continued to sing, and those capable continued to gather. Though he was unsure of the exact direction, it was becoming clear to him that they were heading towards what would be the front end of the ship. Behind the ship beast and his singing companion were 5 crew members, each armed with a light rifle picked from a fallen enemy. These were the only ones who had been left able-bodied enough to walk, and determined enough to fight. Their courage, though, had been met only with tragedy. It had been an hour since they had found anyone still alive, and even the optimistic alien passenger seemed to be growing quieter, her song occasionally breaking at the sight of another fallen friend, or what was left of a fallen friend. Though she seemed to be trying to keep it from those behind her, sobs of sadness could reach his ears. His anger grew. He felt hatred now. Pure, black, and sick hatred. If he let it get to him, he could feel it boiling in his skull, behind his eyes. None should cause this level of pain and suffering. None. The plasma was beginning to cut through the center of the door, and Yatale found she was armed with a gun that might as well be a useless brick. Perhaps she could bludgeon one of the pirates to death with it before they ripped into her and ate her alive. Her tail shivered in terror. On the outside, she continued to sing a low hum of bravery. But she knew that she wasn't fooling anyone into false hope. Her children were behind her, though, and she would not let her spawn to the stars die before she went down protecting them. As she glanced back at them, her song grew. They tended the wounded, and draped shreds of scaled cloth over the faces of the dead. Her crew held determined eyes towards her as she continued to sing. They would stay with their shipmaster to the last. This was the way of their people. The doors began to keel inwards, under the strain as the plasma cut through the final remaining barrier between her crew and certain death. A solid crash echoed through the room. The heavy metal inched forward. Another, and then another. Each time the door moved a little closer, as if it was grasping at straws, trying to keep itself from falling, as if it was trying to buy them seconds more to live. Then, unceremoniously, the doors fell. Yatale had never been one to wait for fate to come to her. She had lived her life seeking it out, and she had planned to die that way. Without waiting, the shipmaster rose to meet the enemy. Her light rifle clutched like a club. A cry of battle sprang from her as she rushed forward. Out of the fog of the plasma breach, an enemy stepped into her view, and she swung with all her might. A solid crack rewarded her effort, and she turned to the next figure, spinning with the impact to try for a second hit. Her target seemed to expect this, though, because the creature ducked low to respond with a double-edged blade. Parrying with a grunt of effort, she caught the weapon with her rifle and hit the creature in the jaw with its butt, then the barrel, then the butt again. Taking advantage of its surprise at such a maneuver, she rammed its chest with the barrel like a spear. It screamed in pain but did not fall. It was large, much larger than her, and its many limbs seemed to tremble in rage as it rose from a hunched-over position to spring at her. Yatale quickly came to the conclusion she was not strong enough to seriously hurt it without a true weapon. Her blows landed and then did nothing of great effect. Her efforts simply seemed to anger it, and despite her speed, she quickly found herself outmatched and pressed to stay alive. It wasn't alone, either, as more of the creatures seemed to be filing in, their many limbs clutching similar bladed weapons that cried out for slaughter. Her crew behind her would face them with bare hands and thrashing tails, They would stand no chance. She had to give it to them. Somehow she had to find a way for them to win. With a quick side parry, she broke the creature's grasp on its blade and stunned it with a thrust to one of its many eyes. It coiled back in pain and rage, and she threw her mangled rifle aside to dive for its weapon. Rolling under another creature's swing, she grasped the grip, and with the full effort of her body came up with a fierce overhead swing, sending the new assailant off guard. Green blood covered her as her effort was rewarded by ripping through the creature's skull down into its chest. She wrenched the sword free and screamed out a song of hope and defiance that died seconds after leaving her throat. 10 more creatures were now in the room, and they all eyed her with a look that meant only one thing: hunger. They circled her with deadly grace, and cut down the crew in their way, forcing the others back. Then they began to play with their food. From every possible angle attacks would fly, and Yatale would desperately parry twice. She fell only to roll up in time to avoid certain death. Slowly but surely they wore her down. Her movements began to falter, and the weapon she held with both hands began to dip lower and lower until it was simply dragging on the ground. In an instant she found herself pinned on her back, as the largest of the group encircling her held her down with its many limbs. It effortlessly plucked the blade she had been using from her hands and slowly dragged it along her belly, cutting her thin gray uniform beneath the cape with a razor's edge. It chuckled as another limb reached out and grabbed her tail and brought it closer to the blade. Her scream of agony could have been heard in a vacuum of the void as the creature began to skin her alive. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate you being here. Welcome to all the new people. We've got a ton of new patrons, just a lot. Too many to shout out, really, but a lot of new people joining over there. So thank you guys so much. They are enjoying some of the benefits. New Discord features, new fun things going on that way. AMAs and fun stuff like that for some of the higher tiers. Access to MP3s of the complete stuff for Shu Chang is available, so that's a good one. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you. I will talk to you all later. Bye, y'all.